Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Nature Live Online. I'm Alison. I'm your host for today. Now, if you are new to Nature Live, we're an event that happens every week from the Natural History Museum, and we're a chance for you to meet and speak with some of the scientific staff that work behind the scenes at the museum. You can find out a little bit about them, about the collections that they look after, and about some of the brilliant research that goes on behind the scenes as well. The museum has opened its doors to the public. Very, very excited about that. But not everyone can safely make it to the museum. So we are bringing our science and our scientists direct to you at home with Nature Live Online. Now, today's topic of conversation is Ice Age giants. We're going to be talking about some fantastic megafauna with one of our scientists, Adrian Lister. Now, I've got lots of questions for Adrian, but I hope that you will have as well. So don't be shy. If you've got any questions at any point during our chat today, post them in the comments and we'll do our very best to answer as many of your questions as we can. But let's meet our scientist for today. Adrian, are you there?
I am here. Hi, Alison. Hi, everyone.
Hi, thank you so much for joining us, Adrian. It's great to see you. Let's start first of all by finding out what you do at the museum.
Well, I work in the Earth Sciences Department of the museum, which is behind the scenes where we have all our collections of fossils and minerals and rocks. And my speciality is fossil mammals, and especially the fossil mammals of the last ice age.
How comprehensive, how big is our fossil mammal collection?
We have a huge collection from all over the world. In the picture, you can see me with some jaws and teeth of the American mastodon, for example. Those are from North America. We have a very large collection from Britain, of course, but that's probably only about 10% of the total. We've got fossil material from every part of the world. There are these fantastic jaws and skulls of American mastodon, one of the megafaunal species actually from the last ice age.
They're absolutely incredible, and some of them barely fitting in the cupboards. It looks like.
Yeah.
Now we're focusing today on the mammals of the Ice Age, which is one of your specialisms. But we should probably start with a little bit of background, some context. So what do we mean when we say the Ice Age? When was the Ice Age?
Well, the ice ages were actually quite recent in Earth history. If we look at that time scale on the left of the slide there, you can see it goes all the way back to about 600 million years ago. At the bottom, MA means millions of years. And at the top, it's 0 MA, which is basically today. It's 0 years ago. And the most recent series of ice ages were really right at the top of that period of time. The last 2.5 million years, the period of time that technically is called the Quaternary that you can see there. But even during that period of time, there was a whole series of ice ages. There were dozens of ice ages. They came and went. There was an ice age, a glacial period. Then there was a warmer period that we call the interglacial, like the one we're in now. Then there was another ice age. The one that we know most about is the very last of those ice ages. And that started about 100,000 years ago and went on until about 12,000 years ago. That may sound like a long time ago, but in geological terms, well, that is very, very recent if we think that that scale goes all the way back to 600 million years ago. And, you know, this is much more recent than, say, the age of the dinosaurs. We have to make a clear distinction between the dinosaurs. You can see there, they were all extinct by 65 million years ago. But the Ice Age mammals like the mammoth lived much more recently, within the last 100,000 years or so, and were contemporary with people.
And what would the world have been like during that most recent Ice Age?
Well, the global climate was, of course, significantly lower than today. It was something like 7 or 8 degrees lower globally than it is today. And as a result of that, the polar ice caps, which today cover the North Pole and over Antarctica on the South Pole, were very much more expanded than they are today. And you can see from this picture that in Europe, the ice sheets came all the way down, as far as Britain is concerned, really up to the English Midlands. And of course, animals didn't actually live on the ice sheets, but south of the ice, the areas on the map with the colours green and brown, there was a lush vegetation of, you know, plants, grasses, and so on, and lots of animals were living on them. So although the climate was generally cold, it was still, as long as you weren't actually stuck in the middle of an actual ice sheet, it was still, you know, from a biological point of view, very, very productive and rich.
And of course, one of the most famous mammals from the Ice Age is of course, the woolly mammoth. Tell us a bit about this amazing animal.
Well, you can actually see this reconstruction of some mammoths. You can see what this kind of landscape looked like. It was largely what we call open. In other words, there weren't very many trees. There's a few trees growing in the background there. But mostly the mammoths and the other animals were living on this rather treeless, grassy kind of plain. Now, the mammoth, if you look at it, of course, it's the most famous Ice Age animal. But a quick glimpse suggests that it's obviously got something to do with elephants. I mean, it looks like an elephant. It's got a trunk, it's got tusks. It's basically an elephant shape. And in fact, as a species, the mammoth was a member of the elephant family. So today we've got the African and the Asian elephants, the only species still remaining, and they're living in the tropics. The mammoth was, if you like, the elephant of the north, the elephant of the Arctic, the elephant of cold climates. And so, of course, it's got that very furry coat, that's why we call it the woolly mammoth. Living elephants have different hair because they are mammals, but it's much more sparse. You can hardly see it from a distance, but the mammoth has had this very thick coat, obviously, to protect it from the cold. It's got that rather peculiar sloping back shape, which modern elephants don't have, and there are differences in the tusks, which we'll put back in a minute.
And how big did they get? We had a question from YouTube asking what the largest megafauna was. Would that be the mammoth?
Well, the woolly mammoth actually was about the size of a modern African elephant. So if you measure the skeleton, the shoulder height was about 3 to 3.5 meters, and they would have weighed about 5 or 6 tons, which is a very big animal, obviously, but actually it's about the same size as a large living African elephant. So I have to disappoint anyone who thinks the mammoth was sort of even much bigger than modern elephants, at least the woolly mammoth. It's about the same size as African elephant. But over in North America, there was another species of mammoth called the Columbian mammoth that was actually a real giant, because the Columbian mammoth got to about 4 meters in shoulder height and could weigh up to 12 tons. So that was probably the biggest megafaunal species globally, and that's really nice, isn't it?
And we know an awful lot about mammoths, don't we? Because we don't just have fossil specimens.
That's right. So, mostly as paleontologists, all we have to work with is the hard parts, the bones and the teeth, because those are the only things that survive. With these Ice Age animals that lived in the high Arctic, we do occasionally get these fantastically valuable complete carcasses preserved. And here we can see the baby mammoth, who was given the name Lyuba, which is a Russian name, because she was found in Siberia a few years ago. And in fact, these pictures are when we had the good fortune to have Lyuba was on loan to the Natural History Museum in London from the museum in Russia, where she normally is on show. And it was a great privilege to see Lyuba. Maybe some viewers were lucky enough to see her when she was with us back in 2014. But what you can see here is not just a skeleton, it's the whole animal. Her hair has actually been lost, but otherwise it's the whole carcass. What probably happened was about 40,000 years ago, in the middle of the last Ice Age, when Lyuba was alive, she must have fallen down some kind of crevasse or other opening in the ground, died and got covered over with frozen soil, and has basically been in a deep freeze ever since. Because in the far north of Siberia, even today, the ground below the uppermost soil is permanently frozen year round. And so that is what has actually kept these carcasses preserved. It's like keeping a joint of meat in your freezer for 40,000 years, this is what you get at the end. And then very occasionally they come to life. And of course we can learn so much about the animal from this that we can't just get from the skeleton, because inside are all the organs. There's her brain, there's her heart, we've done CT scans, you can get DNA out, learn more about the animal in life.
Absolutely incredible specimen. So lucky to have her at the museum. What was their range? Where do we find mammoths? Do we get them here in the UK, for example?
Oh, yeah. So, of course, the Siberian remains are the most famous, but they had an enormous range. And we've got plenty of mammoth fossils from the UK, because if you think back to that map at the beginning, we had the ice sheet in the UK as well, and then south of the ice was the same sort of cool, grassy environment that the mammoth like. This is just one example. This was a gravel pit in Shropshire a few years ago in the west of England, and these workmen were just digging for ground when they started finding these large bones. Turned out to be a complete skeleton of a woolly mammoth, about 12,000 years old, And on the right, you can see a slightly younger version of me, having just pieced together this kind of giant jigsaw of that mammoth skeleton.
We even find them in the North Sea sometimes, don't we? Which is amazing.
Well, that's right. So this is a mammoth jawbone from our collection. And what's unusual about it is one of the teeth there has got an oyster growing on it. Now, that is because this fossil jaw, was actually dredged up from the floor of the North Sea by accident by a fishing boat. Now, how does a mammoth jaw get to the bottom of the North Sea? It's because during the Ice Age, when the ice sheets were so expensive, so much of the world's water was taken up by those ice sheets that global sea level dropped by about 100 meters compared to where it is today. Today we're hearing about sea level going up because the climate is warming. It was the opposite in the Ice Age. Because the climate was very cold, global sea levels were way down. And so lots of parts of the world that are today under the sea were actually dry land. And so animals like the mammoth were just roaming around on these areas of what was then land, dying, sometimes their bones being preserved in the normal sort of way. Then when the Ice Age ended, about 12,000 years ago, the sea level went up, and those bones are on the seafloor, and sometimes they're brought up by fishing boats.
We saw their incredible teeth there. How much do we know about what mammoths ate?
Well, we have good evidence on mammoth diet from the frozen country. So here again is an image of the landscape, as I mentioned, the notice of the grasses and so on. So that immediately gives a clue as to the kind of food that was available to mammoth. But I think we've got a picture of one of the bit of a frozen stomach. That's it. So this chap is holding in one of the museums in Russia part of the stomach of one of the frozen mammoths. So they dissected the mammoth part of the tiny stomach, and you can see the outer skin of the stomach, but inside there is a sort of compressed ball of plant matter. So this is kind of compressed leaves, and under the microscope, this has been dissected apart, and you can see that the seeds, leaves, even down to pollen grains, they can be identified as a species of plant. And from that, we've learned that the mammoth lived on grasses, ferns, mosses, small flowering plants like buttercup, not much in the way of trees and shrubs, unlike living elephants, because there weren't any of them in its environment.
That's absolutely incredible. Adrian, I think you've actually got a specimen with you, haven't you? A tooth that you can show us. Can we take a look?
Yeah. So the mammoth would have picked up its food with its trunk, like the elephants do, put the food into its mouth, and then it's got to chew it up, because grass is a kind of coarse food, you've got to chew it up. I've actually got a real fossil mammoth tooth here. This specimen is about 150,000 years old. It's from a gravel pit in the central England, and this is actually not even a particularly big one. They can get up to about 30 centimeters long. They can weigh up to 4 kilos, one tooth. And this is the sort of business end of the tooth, if you like. These enamel ridges is what the animal used to grind up its food. So if you imagine the upper and lower teeth of the jaw grinding together like that, that is how the animal chewed up its food before it swallowed it.
It's amazing to see it. Yeah, you can really hear that. And what about their tusks as well? They're pretty incredible. How big did they get?
Right, well, the mammoth tusks, here's a wonderful skull that we have in the museum. It's just on Cape Ilford, just outside London. And this is a fabulous pair of tusks. They can be 3.5 meters long. Both sexes have them. They're larger in the males. In fact, the tusk is longer than you can see it here, because if you look at the skull at the sort of top left of the picture, you can see that there are two long tubes of bone, like sockets, that the tusks are inserted into. So about a quarter of the length of the tusk is actually buried within the skull, because it's got to be held obviously very tight, because they're very heavy. The tusk is even longer than it looks there, and up to about 3.5 meters long. And where they differ from living elephant tusks, they've got a much stronger curvature. They're curved and even twisted. And I've actually got a piece of tusk here. So this is not a whole tusk. This piece is about, I don't know, it must be about 70 centimeters long. It's only about, let's say, quarter the length of the total tusk. But if you look at the end there, you can see that the tusk is solid, and it's actually made of dentine, which is exactly the same substance that we have in the middle of our teeth. And the tusks are actually the mammoth's incisor teeth, just like our front teeth, greatly elongated. Another interesting thing about it is, if you look carefully, you should be able to see sort of rings. There are lines going down.
Yes.
Tusk there and there and there. Those are actually the annual growth lines, because the tusk was sort of pushed out from the skull as it grew longer each year. So it's a bit like tree rings, and you count them so you get an idea how old the animal was when it died.
Amazing. Do we know what they use their tusks for?
Well, they were probably mainly used, like modern elephant tusks, for combat or protection, first of all, between individual mammoths. So two mammoths got into a bit of a disagreement over a patch of food, or two males over a female. They would, they have a tussle. Sometimes it could get, nasty, and they have a serious fight with the tusk. Also, it's for protection against predators, because there were some serious predators around, like lions and wolves, and we'll come to some of those in a moment. If confronted with those, it would be all the mammoths forming a line or a ring, head down, tusks forward, a really imposing weapon of protection against predation.
Absolutely. We've had a few questions from our viewers, Adrian, so I'll just dip into some of those. Leonardo on YouTube was asking, why are there no mammoths in South America as they reached Southern Central America?
Yes, a very good point. So mammoths evolved in Europe and Asia. They migrated across when the sea level was down. They migrated over in North America, so there are plenty of mammoths in North America. And they never got through the Panama Isthmus, which is, even in the Ice Age, we're talking about a very tropical environment, a hot, forested environment. This is not a mammoth environment. So, although if they'd been able to get across into South America, the southern part of South America, they would have found lovely grasslands that they probably would have thrived in. But you've got to get there. And in the way was hot tropical rainforest, and so that was a kind of a barrier.
And a great question from Nina on Facebook. We have the preserved carcasses. Will we ever try to use their DNA combined with elephant to try and recreate them?
Well, because there's been an awful lot of talk about this, about cloning a mammoth. I have to say at the moment, it really is not a prospect. It's true that we can extract DNA from parts of the mammoth bones, and especially the frozen carcasses. We've got a lot of mammoth DNA. But the DNA, after tens of thousands of years of burial, is all broken up into little pieces. In order to be able to grow a baby mammoth, you've really got to have it very well organized into the original chromosomes and so on, and it's not like that anymore. It's in tiny fragments. So actually being able to grow a mammoth, even with the help of an elephant cage people are talking about, I think is a very distant prospect, if it can ever be done. What we can do, though, is we can learn a lot about the mammoth from the DNA. That's really the main value of it. So these pieces of DNA represent individual genes. And just to give one example, we extracted the gene that codes for the coat color of the mammoth. So most pictures that you see of the mammoth have them portrayed as a kind of orangey color. That's because the hair that comes out of the Siberian frozen ground has this orange color. But the gene for a coat color actually says they're a kind of dark chocolate brown. And what we now think is that the dark brown color has actually leached out of the hair through long burial. And what's left is this kind of bizarre orange color that wasn't the original. So that's the sort of thing we can learn about the appearance of the animal, about its adaptations from the DNA that we couldn't possibly know, from the fossils themselves. But I think cloning at the moment is not really fun. Anyway, its habitat is no longer there, so it's an arguable proposition anyway.
Exactly. We've got a couple of questions coming in about predation and about their extinction, but we will come back to those. So I hope our viewers will bear with us. We'll definitely answer those, but we'll come back to it because we want to chat about a couple more of these amazing animals. Let's move on to the woolly rhino. This is another Ice Age megafauna. They look quite different to rhinos today. Tell us about these animals.
Yes, well, It is a member of the rhino. It was a member of the rhino family. This is the woolly rhinoceros, and of course, in the same way that we've got the woolly mammoth, which is a kind of hairy, Arctic adapted form of the elephant, and the elephants are today tropical. So the woolly rhino was the hairy, Arctic adapted rhino, and of course today we have the rhinos living in the tropics. So the woolly rhino was a species within the rhino family, but it was adapted to the Arctic. So like the woolly mammoth, it's got the hairy coat. It's got a rather different shape from the modern rhinos. It's got a very long body that's up to about 3.5 even 4 meters in length, weighed about 2 tons, which is about equivalent to very large of the modern rhinos, and seems to have rather short legs compared to the living rhinos, probably because it was feeding almost entirely off the ground rather than browsing off the trees and shrubs like today's rhinos do.
I think we've got an image of their skeleton. We can really see their interesting anatomy here. That there are 2 horns?
That's right. So it's got 2 horns, and the front one is by far the biggest. And this front horn is really remarkable because it's different from all living rhinos in that it's very, very flattened from side to side. So if you look at it from the front, which we don't have here, but it's very, very thin from the front. It's almost sword-like, which is quite remarkable. And rhino horns, we mentioned that the elephant's tusk is made of dentine, like its tooth really. Rhino horn is actually made of compressed hair. So it's keratin, like our hair, like our fingernails. And if you look at it up close, it's very fibrous because those are the individual hairs. But they are really stuck very, very close together to make a very hard structure.
They're really incredible. And we see that really pronounced hump on the back as well. Do we know what that was for?
Well, there's a couple of reasons probably that had that hump. We know from frozen cartilage again that it actually had a fat store around it, so a little bit like camel's hump. And in the case of these animals that were living in the very far north during the Ice Age, I've mentioned that there was plenty of food, at least during the spring and summer months when the vegetation was growing. During the winter, times could have been pretty tough for these animals in terms of getting enough food. So one reason that the woolly rhino had this big hump is it was a big fat store under the skin, which provided energy to keep it through the winter. The other thing is that in the round with the flesh, it actually created a very imposing view. I mentioned what this animal would look like charging towards you in front of you. Well, first of all, you've got those huge horns in your face, and secondly, there's this massive hump behind, which actually gives the animal a really large appearance, gives it kind of a scary appearance, both in terms of competition between, different individuals, and also again, any predators that might be thinking of giving it a go. So the woolly rhino might recommend it.
It's an intimidating animal. Would their lifestyle have been similar to rhinos today, do we think?
As far as we know, apart from the fact they were living in more open country, they were similar in that we think they were probably quite solitary. So whereas the mammoth was almost certainly a herd-living animal, just like living elephants are, you can sometimes find mammoths in what look like preserved family groups, many individuals together. You never find that with the woolly rhino. You always find them singly. So we think probably their lifestyle was more solitary, like the living rhinos.
And visitors to the museum can actually see a specimen of a woolly rhino, can't they?
Yeah, so this is a really unique object because this is actually one of the very rare examples of a carcass. I think you've got a picture of it. Here it is. So this is a cast of a whole carcass of a woolly rhino, bar its hair, which seems to have come loose during burial. But this is not from northern Siberia. This is actually from Europe. This is from Poland. But it's a very, very rare situation where there was a kind of natural seepage of tar, like of natural petroleum underground, where this animal had got buried, which pickled it. In fact, we effectively like a pickled carcass of a woolly rhino from about 30,000 years ago, from the last ice age. It was excavated early in the 20th century. And like the frozen carcasses, it told us a lot more about the soft tissue and the anatomy of the animal.
Yeah, you really get a sense of the power of that animal with the carcass, all that muscle. It's absolutely amazing. We've got a question from Josh on Facebook. Joshua asking, do you think it's likely that the woolly rhino came into conflict over food sometimes with woolly mammoths, or would they have had completely different diets?
That's a very interesting question. In fact, some of the research we're doing at the museum is to try and find out how these animals differed in their diet. Because normally you expect that animals living in a similar environment, they do differ in the kinds of food that they eat. From the stomach contents, it seems that the woolly rhino was more dedicated to very low growing grasses and herbs and so on, whereas the woolly mammoth had a slightly more varied diet, including the odd shrubs and ferns and so on. There are also areas, like there are some areas of Siberia where mammoths live and not the rhinos. And we're trying to figure out why that is. I don't have a complete answer to the question, but it's a good question.
Very good question. And just quickly back to our mammoths, there was another question that came asking, I think it was Susan on YouTube, was asking how long mammoths live, what's their average lifetime?
Yes, so we think probably about 60 to 70 years for the woolly mammoth, which is similar to the very longest of the living elephant can live. The Colombian mammoth, which was the one in North America, which is actually bigger, might have lived to been as much as 80 or 90 under optimal conditions. And of course, they had few or no natural predators once they were adults. The young animals, could be predated sometimes. But once an animal reached adulthood, unless it got disease or something, then it was likely to survive until, close to its full lifespan, probably about 60 to 70 years.
Yeah, not easy to take down a full-grown mammoth, I would imagine. Now, let's move on to another example of our megafauna. I know, Adrian, this is one of your favourites, the Irish elk, or the giant deer. Tell us about this amazing specimen.
Yeah, well, this is a wonderful animal, one of my favourites actually. And the so-called Irish elk, I call it the giant deer. It was the largest species of deer that ever lived. And sadly, it's no longer with us, but it was about 2 meters high at the shoulder, and you can see the total height of the animal is quite a lot bigger than that. And of course, its most striking feature is those antlers. Not only was it the largest ever species of deer, it had by far the largest species of antlers ever to evolve. Almost all living species of deer have antlers. And one remarkable thing about it is that they're shed each year. All deer drop their antlers in the spring. It's only the males that have them, by the way, and that was true of the Irish elk as well. We have female skulls, no antlers. Only the male ones that have the antlers. And every spring and summer, they have to start from scratch, regrowing a new set of antlers. And those antlers are solid bone. So they're different from the mammoth tusks that are dentine, ivory. The rhino horn that is keratin or hair, it's a solid bone. That is a huge amount of energy and growth, and you have to put into those each year. So the Irish elk antlers could be 3.5 meters across and weigh about 40 kilos. It's actually, the total span of the antler is longer than the animal itself. It's incredible. So the Irish elk had to live in areas with pretty rich vegetation, and they mostly lived kind of a bit to the south of where the mammoth and woolly rhinos were, where there was also growth of trees and shrubs that would give it plenty of calcium, plenty of food, grow those antlers every year.
Those antlers are amazing. They must have been incredibly heavy to to carry around. Absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
Where do we find them?
Oh, yeah, no, I found it heavy. It is amazing. I wonder what it must have felt like for these males here to carry those big ants. They must have had a great sense of relief when they dropped them in the spring every year. To feel quite lightheaded for a few months until the new set grew. You asked where we find the fossils. So
yeah.
It's become known as the Irish elk, but this species wasn't restricted to Ireland. It's known as the Irish elk because most of the best fossils do come from Ireland, although in fact we find them across a wide range from Ireland to really the westernmost point of their range, right across Europe, about halfway across Russia basically, just into Siberia. The reason why it's been known as the Irish elk is that people started finding the bones of these species in Ireland. They've been finding them for hundreds of years, even back to the 16th century, because a lot of Ireland is covered by a thick layer of peat. And people historically have dug up this peat to use as fuel, burned in fireplaces and so on. And in digging up this peat, or quite often underneath the peat, they would start to find the bones of these giant deer. Basically, there about 12,000 years ago, before the peat started to accumulate on top. And they're preserved there in big numbers, so they became known as the Irish elk. And in fact, a lot of the skeletons that are in museums all around the world did come originally from Ireland.
They're amazing animals. So far, we've been concentrating on herbivores. We had a question earlier from Periscope asking what kinds of things would attack a mammoth. So what sorts of carnivores were around at the time?
Yes. So in the Ice Age, there were animals closely related to species that we today find only in the tropics, like lions. There were lions in Britain and Europe and North America. There were wolves, there were bears. But there were also extinct carnivores. And because here we see perhaps the most famous of them, and that's the saber-toothed cat. In fact, the saber-toothed cats were themselves a whole family of big cats. There were many different species. This is the best known one, which is called Smilodon, which is especially well known from tar pits of La Brea in California. And a lot of research has been done recently into the saber-toothed cat, and especially, how did it use those enormous, enlarged canine teeth that it had? How did it hunt its prey? You can see also in that reconstruction that it had a very, very wide gape, and we know this from studying the joints in the skull. And there's a clue here, because if you've got enormously long canines like that, you couldn't use them unless you could open your mouth very wide, otherwise they would be, the jaw would get in the way. So it all sort of works together. An old idea that these animals sort of hunted like lions, basically chasing after their prey. They would have hunted things like deer, bison, pretty big animals. But the idea that they might chase after them and somehow using those canines to bring the animal down, bring the prey down, really is not what we think now at all. If you look at the skeleton of the animal, it's got very, very powerful front limbs, very powerful front paws, and very large claws on its front paws. And what we think is that this is actually what we call an ambush predator. It's not an animal that would have chased after its prey for long distances. It would have laid in wait, maybe hiding behind some vegetation, or maybe a little way up a tree, waiting for a suitable prey to come by, and then pounce. And it basically would have pounced with those powerful front legs, held its prey down with those powerful paws, and then use the canines to actually press into the neck or the stomach of the animal to cut the nose and blood vessels and basically kill the prey. Bit of a gory image, but that is now how we feel that it used those canines. And by the way, they are also they're quite sort of thin, from side to side. They don't have a round section like a lion's canine. They're actually quite thin and sword-like, so they would have been with a sharp edge, so they would have been very effective in cutting through the prey animal.
They look incredibly cumbersome, those huge teeth, but really, really effective weapon. Yeah. We've had a question from YouTube on the subject of woolly mammoths and saber-tooths, asking who would win in a fight between a mammoth and a saber-toothed tiger. Could they take down a mammoth?
Well, that's a very interesting question. There's a cave in Texas, actually, which dates from the Ice Age, and it's full of fossil bones that have been excavated. And it's clear that this was a den, that this cave was a den of saber-toothed cats. And it's got lots of bones of prey animals, and it includes lots of very young mammoths. It's got baby mammoths, or very young mammoths, and no adults. So what it looks like is that the big cats could occasionally take a very young mammoth. The large adult mammoths were certainly too big and too powerful and too dangerous for the big cats to approach. It's an interesting issue, though, because almost certainly the mammoths, just like living elephants, the adults would have protected their young very, very much. We mentioned earlier about the way they would have used their tusks. If a group of saber-tooths approached then the mammoth would have put down their tusk, the young would have gone behind. So quite difficult. But if you think about what I said about how the saber-tooth operated an ambush predator, it could occasionally pounce on the young animal and quickly pull it out of the way before the adults got wind. So
Definitely.
Pretty dramatic scene.
If we had another question from YouTube, just going back to our Irish elk, asking about those antlers. Might the great antlers of the Irish deer have contributed to its extinction? Might they have been a bit expensive to make?
This is a very interesting question because they require a great deal of nutrition and so on. And as we'll talk about in a minute, one of the reasons why a lot of these animals went extinct partly is probably because the quality and quantity of the vegetation they were feeding on went down. I've actually done a sort of a study of this, and we looked at the antlers of some of the very latest known of the Irish elk. In other words, individuals that are dated, fossils that are dated just before the moment they went extinct. And you might predict that the antlers perhaps would have got smaller if the animal was adapting to lower the amount of vegetation. You would expect that. In fact, we didn't find that. The antlers of the very last ones are just as big. So the sexual selection, the reason for the antlers being there was still very, very strong right up to the end. And what that suggests is that it could have been, after all, a factor. Because in a situation where the amount of food is going down, and the animals, as it were, this is a very anthropomorphic way of putting it, they're not going to give up their antlers because they need them for fighting, as it were. They're going to keep growing them, even though the food has gone down. That's what it seems. Could have been a factor. A factor. I don't think it was the main reason. There was a very old theory from the 19th century that you've got the idea of the early days of thinking about evolution. They thought the antlers evolved bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until the animals basically keeled over because it didn't carry them anymore. We don't think that anymore, obviously. They were an adaptation. But yet, at the point where the food was getting very, sparse, it could have been a factor.
And while we're on the subject of extinction, we had a couple of questions earlier. Susan asking how long mammoths have been extinct. So when did these animals become extinct, and do we know why?
Yeah, well, the mammoth was actually one of the very latest ones to go extinct, only about 4,000 years ago. But those very last populations were only on some remote islands in the Arctic Ocean. Across the very major part of its range, it was extinct by about 10,000 years ago, and so were most of the other megafauna. And we know that, well, one of the species we talked about today, the mammoth, the woolly rhino, the giant deer, the saber-tooth, and many others around the world went extinct at around the same time. And it's basically towards the end of the last ice age. So it's really the last few thousand years of the last ice age. So here we are. And you can see some of the species we've been talking about today, but you can see also there were lots of other megafaunal species that we haven't had time to talk about. But there was the mastodon that we mentioned at the beginning in North America. There were giant sloths. There were giant kangaroos in Australia. They all died out around this period of time. And it's really the few thousand or 20,000 years towards the end of the last ice age and into the beginning of the present interglacial. And they died out. And the big question is why?
So presumably the climate was changing, their environment, their habitat was changing quite a lot.
Yes, so one of the sort of main reasons that we think is we know that the climate is changing dramatically because this is really the transition from the ice age conditions that we talked about into the present day interglacial conditions. So that kind of very widespread open, grassy, but quite rich habitat vegetation that you can see in the picture there, which is what the animals like the mammoth and the woolly rhinos are adapted to. That really started to disappear because as the climate warmed, so the trees started to spread, the forest started to spread across that formerly open habitat. And in fact, if you consider most of Europe and North America, apart from, of course, modern human activity, which of course removed some of the forest agriculture and cities and so on, but naturally the modern vegetation should be something like this. All of these regions now would be closed in forest, And shortly after the end of the Ice Age, this is what it looked like. The forests had been surviving to the south of the mammoth habitat during the Ice Ages. When the climate warmed, they expanded northward. But all those areas that the mammoth were living in became like this. And of course, this is not the habitat. It's warm. It hasn't got the grassy plains. Instead, it's got this kind of forest vegetation that the mammoth and woolly rhinos are not adapted to eating. And so the ranges of these species became reduced and reduced with time as the forest became more and more extensive. So that is certainly one probably major contributing factor to their eventual extinction. And then, the other sort of natural modern habitat in the far north was the tundra habitat. And I think we can see a picture of that. This is a modern tundra. So north of the forest belt, in the place of the open grasslands, the tundra developed. And of course, you can see today it supports some animals like reindeer and muskox, but they are adapted to living on what is actually quite a poor-growing, rather nutrient-poor kind of environment. The tundra is not a rich habitat. An adult mammoth would have needed something like 200 kilos of grass food a day to survive. It wouldn't get that kind of food on this environment. So between the two major modern environments, it's taken over its former habitat, the forest and the tundra. Animals like the mammoth didn't find the habitat or the food that they were adapted to. That was certainly a contributing factor.
Could humans have been a factor as well? Because obviously they were around at the same time, and we have this theory that hunting might have played a role.
That's right. Well, this is the other main factor, of course. And people have been around for quite a long time before this, including hunting large mammals. But from about 15,000 years ago, roughly at the same time as the climate was warming, in fact, partly because of climate was warming and becoming more favourable to humans, humans were spreading in numbers. They were spreading around the world to areas that hadn't formerly inhabited, like north of Siberia, into North America, increasing in numbers. And so the pressures that they were putting on the large mammoth prey was certainly increasing. And we know for sure that, from human archaeological habitation sites, that people were hunting these large animals. Now, whether they were hunting them, because it's still relatively small numbers of people. But it's nothing like today, even though I said they were expanding in numbers. Still relatively small numbers of people. Whether they could have hunted these animals to such an extent as to drive them extinct as the sole factor, I think is quite unlikely. But if you put together the fact that the climate change and the habitat change have already reduced the ranges of these animals, and then you put an added pressure of human hunting on top of it, that probably is the answer as to why they died out.
And there's an analogy today, isn't there, with our current megafauna?
Well, yes, absolutely, because we've mentioned already that the extinct megafauna have living relatives, and they themselves are endangered. If you think about the mammoth, its living relatives, the African and the Asian elephant, are endangered. You think about the woolly rhino, all of the rhinos around the world today are endangered, and they are under similar pressures in a way to what drove the Pleistocene megafauna extinct. Because if you think about the Asian elephant shown there in the picture, its range has been greatly reduced, mainly because of the loss of its habitat. Now, of course, in this case, it's because of human action that the habitat has been lost. In the Ice Age, it was because of climate that the habitat has been lost. But it has the same effect. It greatly reduces the numbers of the animals. Asian elephants are now down to about 30,000 animals in the wild. And on top of that, these animals are also still being hunted. We call it poaching, but it's the same thing. Elephants are poached or hunted for their tusks, for their ivory, mainly. So, in a way, although the causes are a bit different, the living megafauna are being hit by a lot of their habitat and hunting on top of it. And we just said, that is probably why the Ice Age megafauna went extinct. So, if you like, it's a kind of a lesson from the past to the present, that this is what the effect can be.
Absolutely, a very powerful lesson as well. Adrian, we are almost out of time. I just want to squeeze in just a couple more questions from our viewers, because earlier on YouTube we had a question asking if there are more, are we finding more megafauna? Do we think there are more species to be found?
Yes, especially in parts of the world which have not previously been excavated or studied as much, some others. So, for example, in Australia and South America, new species of giant sloth have been discovered. New species of the giant armadillos, the diptodons that lived in South America, have been discovered. So there's always new surprises in paleontology. Yeah.
And one final question, which was from Abigail on Facebook, asking earlier on if you have a favourite fossil at all.
Oh, I think that skeleton of the mammoth that we dug up in Shropshire has a special meaning for me because it was quite early in my career and it was just absolutely amazing to go to the site and be there and dig up the. Oh, there we go. Actually, help dig up the bones of this animal that's been lying in the ground for 12,000 years. And I actually learned my mammoth anatomy from putting that giant jigsaw puzzle together. And what was also very nice about that find, like other fossil finds, is that it caused enormous interest for the public. And it's so great to be able to explain to people about this animal that has lived where they now live, only 12,000 years ago. So I don't know if that's a special place in my heart. There are others, but that's the first one that comes to mind.
Oh, that's fantastic. We are sadly out of time, but that's a lovely point to end on, I think. Adrian, thank you so much for joining us today and for taking us through these amazing animals. I'm hopefully we can have you on again soon because there's lots more to talk about, but we'll say goodbye to you for now. But thank you so much. We'll see you again soon.
Bye, everyone.
And thank you to you, our viewers, for all of your fantastic questions. Apologies if we didn't get to all of them. We are limited for time, but thank you so much for joining us. Do come and join us again. We're here every week. We're Tuesdays at 12 and Fridays at 10:30. This coming Friday, we've got dinosaurs. We've got Paul Barrett talking dinosaurs. So do join us for that one. Keep an eye on our Facebook and YouTube channels. Keep an eye on the website as well for updates. We hope to see you all again soon, but for now we'll say goodbye. Thank you again and have a great day.